Thank you everyone, and good morning. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you to UCLA. Thank you, Amy, for coming all this way. Let's just jump right into what, at least I think, is the most important question. And you will disagree with me. And you're never shy about disagreeing, so we're fine on that. But let me just do the overarching framing. The framing is that America has held itself together because we are party to a kind of creedal nationalism that we're bound together by a set of common ideas, common documents, common ideas that go back 250 years, imperfectly executed over time, but still something that unifies us. But we are under a kind of unique pressure now. There's technological pressure. There's the pressure of an economy that is unfair to large swaths of America. There's pressure from tribalism, which is one of your big subjects. So the question is, the overall question is, can the creedal nationalism, can the idea that we're bound together by an idea, overcome all of the things that are pulling us apart right now?
Great. Well, first,
and answer that in a tweet.
Okay. Well, first, it's great to be here. Thanks for including me. And I half agree with you, and I'm optimistic. I think the answer is going to be yes, but I think you're romanticizing it when you say this is the way America always was. So the first thing—
I didn't say, I mean, I'm recognizing that—
Of course.
The expansion of rights is part of the story of America.
But when we say there's suddenly tribalism right now, I think part of what we need to recognize is that there's always been tribalism. It's just that for most of America's history, there was one very dominant tribe, you know, whites. I know it's a social construct, but basically, this country was dominated economically, politically, and culturally by a white majority. So you didn't feel the tribalism. It felt we're using these universalist concepts. What's happened right now is something that is unprecedented, and that is that because of these massive demographic changes— so the first thing I was going to say is part of what is so disturbing and feels awful on a day-to-day basis is actually, I think, healthy. It's like a lot of previously silenced voices finally having the chance. Having said that, we are at an unprecedented moment for this reason. Because whites used to be so dominant overwhelmingly, all kinds of terrible things could happen, but we had a comfortably dominant group. What's happened now is that with these massive immigration flows and the demographic transformation, whites are on the verge of losing their majority status, people say in about 20 years. And the result of that is today in America, every group feels threatened. So every group, not just minorities, but also whites. Yeah.
You make this point in your book that that when you have a truly dominant group in a society, that dominant group can either be cruel to minorities or generous to minorities, and we've experienced both of those phenomena in American society. But talk about countries where there is no dominant ethnic or racial group. How do they hold themselves together? Are there any positive examples for America out there in the future?
So I have been studying developing countries and non-Western countries for 20 years, and I go around and at these talks, people say, is there a model for America to follow to help us get out of this political tribalism? And Jeff, I always say, we are the model. I actually think for all of our flawed problems and history, that we have the best apparatus. And so this term that I coined in the book is actually super important. We are something that I call a supergroup, and it's a very simple concept. A supergroup is a country that has, first, a very strong overarching collective identity, American, whatever it is. But at the same time, a supergroup has to satisfy a second requirement, and that is it allows lots of individual subgroup identities to flourish. So at our best, we're a country where somebody can be Croatian American, Libyan American, Korean American, and very patriotic at the same time. And this is so rare. I say that alone among the major powers, only the United States is a supergroup. If you think of a country like France, it's got that very strong overarching identity, but it doesn't allow subgroup identities to flourish. The burkini ban, the hip. So what I think the challenge is right now is it's that first piece. How do we retain a national identity, you know, the sense of being American that is capacious enough to include people that say, you know what, the people who wrote this Constitution that you're all celebrating, they enslaved my people. I mean, why? But what I think is important to realize is that America has always been an aspirational country. You know, I teach on a very liberal college campus too, and I always say that both the right and the left, we have to realize we're playing with poison. So it's one thing to say that we have a great Constitution and we've repeatedly failed, you know, disgracefully to live up to those ideals, or to say that all of those ideals are frauds. This is a country completely just built on genocide and white supremacy.
So has the American dream been attained by anyone, or is the American dream itself something that is unobtainable but a target?
This is a huge question. It depends how you define the American dream, but I would say that a lot of, if you ask a lot of immigrants in this country from every part, especially the older generation, like my parents' generation, maybe your grandparents, they feel they got the American dream. That is, there are tons of people who come from my parents came from the Philippines. And, you know, it's interesting, they just love this country. And they started literally with nothing, and they rose. So, but the problem, of course,
my grandparents are from shitholes, actually.
Same with mine, you know.
Yeah.
But the problem is that it's always been the fact that large segments of America were never, the American dream was not available to them. And that's been true from the beginning. Right, and so I think to make what I say to the right, you know, to the left, I'm saying, like, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We have to go back.
Well, so go to this question, because you work on a very liberal campus. You see the rise of identity politics. Identity politics has positive attributes. I think you think that there's also some negative attributes if it comes out of whack. So talk about the promise and the threat of identity politics and whether they can subsume this common vision.
I think one of the problems now is we're stuck in terrible vocabulary. Every word is weaponized, you know, and words are overused. White supremacy, racism, they lose their meaning. So right now, there's a big new move from progressives in response to identity politics, and that's liberalism. That's where we need to go. Let's go back to that Enlightenment principle.
So-called colorblindness.
Yes, and what I like about the supergroup identity is that I think it says we don't need to make that false choice. You know, as somebody that obviously has always been an outsider, I think it's ridiculous to tell people, get rid of your ethnic identity, get rid of your racial identity. It's like telling somebody to stop liking your sports team, the Bruins, you know, and just be world football. It's not going to work. It's human nature. We're all tribal. But the point of the supergroup idea is that you can retain your individual tribal subgroup identities on campus. You know, I mentor the Asian American Association, the Black Students Association. But the key is you've got to have some kind of connective tissue that joins all those groups together, in this case, as fellow Americans. And for that, we need to have a conversation. And that's where this current rigidification and hardening of group lines, I think it's preventing us from having conversations when we most need to have it. I mean, at this point, and everybody in this room will know what I mean, many of us they see people on the other side of the political divide, not just as people we really disagree with, but as immoral, evil un-Americans. And if you start to feel that way about 60 million people, this is not where we want to be.
But let's just face facts that we are in a unique political moment, that those 60 million people, I'm not going to stipulate that the 60 million are all racists. I'm going to stipulate that in order to vote for Donald Trump, you had to at least overlook certain aspects of his character and his statements. And so if you're African American, Hispanic, Muslim American, that's kind of cold comfort. So this yes. moment is that we're not in a normal moment, and we're under unique stresses.
Again, no, we are in a terrible moment. We're not in a normal moment, but as somebody that studied U.S. history, I think we tend to romanticize U.S. history too. There's a lot.
This isn't the worst moment.
It's not the worst moment, but also a lot of what we're seeing now, people just forget our history. And I will, just to be provocative, I will say, just
you? Tiger Mom? Really?
So I've been studying developing countries for most of my career, which is not about parenting, but I've been studying market-dominant minorities, these hated little minorities like whites in South Africa or the 3% Chinese in Indonesia that are viewed, actually not just viewed, they control wildly disproportionate economic and political power. So one of the things that I think has happened in this country, we've never had a market-dominant minority like this at the national level. That's part of what's allowed us to be more stable.
We had a market-dominant majority.
But exactly. We had the opposite problem, a very overwhelmingly economically and politically dominant majority. But what I'm saying now is that because of our demographic changes and a lot of white-on-white resentment, like a class is dividing our whites, we are now seeing for the first time in our history the emergence of our own version of a market-dominant minority, coastal elites. And that's a misnomer. Not all coastal, not all elite in the sense of wealthy. I'm referring to everybody in this room, including myself. And to go back to the election, I think if you get out of the narrow American, it's all about us framework, and start looking at us compared to countries that we think we have nothing in common with, like Venezuela, or Indonesia, you see that if you look at the rhetoric, coastal elites they're viewed as this little minority controlling the media, Silicon Valley, Wall Street, Hollywood, the universities, who love minorities, they love immigrants, they want to help the poor in Africa, but they don't care about real Americans. And that's the danger. When you get that idea, you can get these populist demagogues. They come in. We saw this in the Philippines, in Serbia, and Malaysia. And the idea is a demagogue says, you know what? You know why you're suffering? You know why you don't have a job? Because these not real foreigners have taken over. We need to take back our country. And that was Make America Great Again. Let's take back our country.
Do you believe that white working class people who think of themselves now as an aggrieved minority have any point, any argument to the things that they feel?
This is the question that's always like a trap on liberal college campuses, because you ask it and then instantly there's not a good conversation. False equivalency, are you saying slavery is as bad as politically correct activists? No, I want to stipulate, no, But I think it depends at what level you ask the question. Is there anything comparable to what African Americans or Native Americans have suffered at the general level? Have whites in this country experienced that? No. Right? But if you ask, in my book, I note that in the Yale Law School class of 2019, I conducted a study. We have lots of minorities, racial and ethnic minorities. We've done outreach. We've tried. It's not enough, but we've tried, maybe 70 of we have exactly one out of a class of 200, one poor white. And from the perspective of that poor white, that's why I say it depends on what level you ask the question. He feels very aggrieved. His family has no money. Every day he comes in and he's called a bigot and a racist. He doesn't know the right vocabulary. I mean, it's very elite, actually, to know how to speak. He got into Yale
Law School. He must have something going for him.
Well, he's one. Right? He has a lot going for him. He's very, very smart. His family has tremendous illness. There's a lot of addiction. So every day that he comes in, he worked 3 jobs. He's the only person to work, the only person, but he works more than anybody else, these outside jobs. And so for him to hear every day, you are so privileged, you just step to the back. So at the personal level, I get it. I get why he feels aggrieved. And we don't do affirmative action for poor whites. We're starting. We now have something called first-generation professionals. We're trying to diversify in terms of class also, but that's not what we've done historically.
Right. Let me ask you one question about immigration. Do you ever fear, and I ask this because I just visited one of the countries my grandparents are from, which is a truly dysfunctional country. It wouldn't be defined as a shithole by Donald Trump because it's white, but it's not a healthy place. Everybody I met wants to come to America. Do you envision a moment in which immigrants no longer want to come here? I mean, is that the flip side of a worry about excess immigration? Is that we look so dysfunctional to the world that people might think that's not where the future is?
Again, I'm an optimist. I mean, that's part of what's so terrible about this moment. Always felt so much pride going around. I mean, not always, but people always wanted to come here, and now it's a terrible moment, but I think that people will always want to come here. We don't have perfect institutions, and I'm speaking as an immigrant's daughter. I think the immigration topic, especially at a place like Los Angeles, is one that we really need to talk about, and it's key to your first question. What is this American dream national identity? And I think we are at this moment where we need to renegotiate this. We need to say, look, we need to be honest about our history, but we can't whitewash it. We need to be, really, a lot of our founders did all these terrible things. But again, we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, which is what I see among a lot of young progressives, which is just the Constitution. That was a dead white male, and so I'm saying.
And you see young progressives who want to get rid of the Constitution or revise it in some dramatic way.
Yes, or certainly don't respect it very much, and I understand where that's coming from. And what I think what's key is that if you belong to, and this is the message for the right that always thinks it has the monopoly on patriotism. But the point is that if you want, patriotism is not just about singing the anthem very loudly. If you want a really unified country and to give meaning to this idea of a strong America, it has to be a country where the constitutional rights feel real and legitimate to all groups.
Right.
If you come from a marginalized group and every day your experience is that your group isn't afforded the same dignity and respect as other more powerful groups, why would you believe in these principles of equality and liberty? They just ring hollow. Right. So, the task is partly to make those ideals real. But the challenge for the left is to remember that the Constitution, our ideals have always exceeded our reality. That's the beauty of America. It's not the beauty, but it's the promise of America.
Right. Let's go to a couple of questions from the audience. We have people with mics running or walking fast.
Hi, Jonathan Taplin, USC Annenberg Innovation Lab. After the Vietnam War, Richard Rorty suggested that the left began to shatter because there were a certain number of people on the left who believed that America was unachievable. That was his word. That it was born in sin and irredeemable. And so they just said there's no way for politics to work. Do you think that's still happening now, and that there's a certain part of the left who just thinks that, we created this original sin with Native American genocide and slavery, and we can never get out of it, and who cares? Very
much so. And the problem is that there's more than a grain of truth to that. This is original sin, original stain, and that's what I mean by I think it's really important to focus, to believe that it's possible to have a document, which I think is the key to our national identity, that holds all these incredibly important principles that are worth fighting for, and to be able to acknowledge that a lot of the people who wrote that document were very flawed people, and in some case, yes, they were white supremacists. But I think that's and the problem is right now we're in this tribal situation. What I see on a campus is we never really have that conversation. It's just everybody on both sides, they just fling terms around. And if somebody gets called a bigot and a white supremacist repeatedly, the reaction is not to say, oh my gosh, you're right, I need to go vote for the other side. That's not their experience. They go inwards, and what I fear with too much berating from the left is I see things go underground, where that's where the real extremism is. And you should see the emails I get. There is enormous hate and racism in this country.
Hi, Terrence McNally. I host a radio show and podcast, Freeform, A World That Just Might Work. My question is, you're saying that there's got to be recognition, there's got to be outreach, there's got to be communication with the white working or poor class. What are the most successful examples you've seen of that being done?
The two, so actually, my final chapter is very optimistic. There are tons of studies that show that if you can pull people out of their group or tribal context, say a Trump voter and a non-Trump voter, and have them actually interact as human beings, not just exposure. That can make people hate more. More diversity can lead to more hatred, but actually interact as human beings. Talk about children, pets, sports. People come together in very, very surprisingly. So the two very positive examples, actually, one is the integration of the US military in the 50s. It was a very similar situation back then. People said, 70% of the country, the military, we can't do this. But after, and these did involve white working class, but also African Americans, at that point, Italian Americans, German Americans, and after they integrated it, they found that the integrated troops were as or more effective than the all-white troops, and then they conducted all these interviews, and what people said was, when you are in that same foxhole, when your life is at stake, you miss your family in the same way. When you have to put your life in the hands of somebody else, it doesn't matter what the color of their skin is or whether they're white working class. So that was one actually, there are lots of positive examples. In my own classroom, I've tried. I'm not trying to say that it's easy. I think it takes a lot of structure and leadership. I try, admittedly, I don't teach, it's not a class about abortion or death penalty. But I teach a class called International Business Transactions that is well known for being the most diverse, both racially and ethnically, but I have very large numbers of the conservatives in my class. And what I do is I lay the ground rules. I say, we're going to have this conversation. And here, if somebody says something in a way that offends you or is not the way you would say it, for just this class, can you not assume immediately that it's because the person is a xenophobic, bigot, racist? Just try and let's have, and on the other side too, and I don't want to say it's easy, but I have seen, even just in my own life, I've seen cases.
Hi, I'm Dia. I'm a student at UCLA. And my question is, how do you teach empathy to groups such as Appalachian whites or people that are disadvantaged? Because when we look at it, I don't feel like they understand how epigenetics plays a role into minority groups in terms of slavery or Native Americans basically internalizing the effects of the Trail of Tears and all that. So how do we teach them to be empathetic towards our hardships of the past that may still affect us today?
This is my greatest frustration. I believe that when you just hear a story, human beings, about some of these grievances and what many minority students have to endure on just a daily basis, or I'll just read some newspaper article that is uncontested. Some African-American mother did one little thing, nobody got hurt, and she's in prison for 25 years. I think it doesn't matter what political party you're in. I think if you can experience that as just a human being, people would be on the same page. Where it can be tough on the left too is I don't think we're doing a good job. I tell my own students that by overusing certain terms, if everything is white supremacist, if everything is racist, then people just kind of hunker down. And I don't think listening. I think people cannot listen to each other right now because they're feeling very defensive. They're feeling constantly, this is how I started. It's not just racial, right? With Donald Trump in the office, women feel incredibly threatened, but with the Me Too movement, men feel threatened. And what happens when people feel actually threatened is they retreat into tribalism and they don't listen. So I wish I had an answer for that. That's, I think, the most important question. Sometimes I almost want to fall back on the arts and literature, it's just a poem or something, because I don't think it's working right now in the political sphere. Partly because of our system. It encourages actually playing to the base. And so, great question.
Let me ask you a final question before we have to wrap up, and we do have to wrap up. This is also an important question. You're an optimist. So tell us why the Constitution and the American system, the apparatus you talk about, why is that stronger than Trumpism, and why will that win?
It is an absolutely unique document and system that we have. I'm sure there are lawyers in here, but most Americans don't realize how rare it is for us to have birthright citizenship. Try it. No other European country, no Asian country. They're just a handful, and most countries are going in the opposite direction. Why is that important? It means that, as a matter of our Constitution, the American identity doesn't belong to anybody. And if you asked me earlier, most countries, again, we're so in our own bubbles, most countries are ethnic nations. You know, they're rooted in one ethnicity. So we really have something very special. We have an ethnically and religiously neutral national identity. Again, not in lived practice, but that's our apparatus. And we really have, you know, in the book I say that we are exceptional. We have, in two ways, we have been, in fact, exceptionally racist. Alone among the major powers, only we have had such extensive slavery within our borders for so long. But we have also, at the same time, been exceptionally inclusive. It's possible to be both. We've had, you know, mostly with the white immigrants, but we've had extraordinary assimilation. And so I think that the American experiment is really unique. I think generation after generation, there have been nativist, xenophobic voices, and every generation before, we've overcome it. And you know, let's not be the weak link. But I think part of that is that we, right now, again, since I think this is our crowd here, on the left, you know, I think people, I was telling you last night, you know, imagine if China found that in 20 years, it was going to be majority white, Caucasian, or Ghana. If Ghana, a country, just learned that because of an influx of white immigrants, they were going to become a white nation, how would those people feel? Anxiety. They would feel cultural anxiety. And so I think it's, instead of immediately going to this like 60 million bigoted rate, you know, I think we have to acknowledge that demographic change is very dislocating and try to begin to have that conversation, because that's, you know, that's the only way we're going to move forward.
Amy, thank you very, very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.